The ocean never forgets. Even when we try to bury memories beneath sand and salt, even when we build walls of glass and marble to keep the past out, it remembers. It remembers the names we whisper in the night, the promises we break, the love we lost, and the grief we refuse to face. Margaret Hale had learned this truth the hard way. She stood on the balcony of her new house perched on the cliffs above Monterey Bay, wrapped in a thick shawl against the biting November wind. Her hair, silver and unkempt, whipped across her face. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, black and cold, waves rolling in ceaseless rhythm. Below, the rocks were slick with foam, and gulls screamed their mournful songs. Margaret's hands rested on the railing. Her fingers, knotted with age, trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of memory. It had been 12 years since she had last seen her daughter, Eleanor. 12 years since she had held her grandchildren, since she had spoken to the two people who had once been the center of her universe. 12 years. And now they were coming back. Margaret could feel it, even before the knock on the door came. The ocean, vast and knowing, had whispered it to her, in the wind, in the creaking boards of the deck, in the low, persistent hum of waves striking the cliffs. Her house was a fortress of glass, wood, and marble, a luxury she had purchased with the modest fortune built from years of perseverance, selling her pies and pastries at the local farmer's market. Every Sunday, she had stood behind her stall, smiling at strangers who appreciated her baking more than her own family had. Every caramel drizzle, every perfectly browned pie crust, every bite of her chocolate fudge cake had been a tiny rebellion against the abandonment she endured. She had survived. And now, from behind the heavy oak door, there came a knock. 2 knocks. Then a third. Hesitant, almost fearful. Margaret didn't move. She let them knock again. The wind carried the sound across the terrace and into her bones. Finally, with deliberate calm, she opened the door. There they were. Eleanor, her daughter, now a woman in her 40s, and Gregory, her husband. Faces she hadn't seen in 12 years. They looked smaller, older, and more desperate than she remembered. Their eyes darted across the interior of her home, taking in the Italian leather furniture, the gleaming hardwood floors, the panoramic view of the ocean stretching endlessly beyond. "Mom?" Eleanor's voice trembled, thin, uncertain, fragile. Margaret noted every detail. Eleanor's worn green dress, the cracks in her synthetic leather shoes, the faint worry lines etched into her forehead, the subtle tremble of her hands. Gregory's expensive suit hung oddly, as if it had been pressed into service for this visit. His tie crooked, his eyes darting to every corner of the room as though evaluating the worth of a life built without them. Margaret's lips curved into a slow, almost imperceptible smile. She said, "Talk." Her voice, calm, steady, stronger than she expected it to be. "How interesting. After 12 years of absolute silence, now you want to talk." The color drained from their faces. Eleanor opened her mouth. Gregory cleared his throat, but words failed them. Margaret stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. She watched their shadows stretch across the marble floor, saw them flinch at the scent of salt air and the faint aroma of vanilla and cinnamon lingering from her morning baking. For 12 years, she had baked alone. Every Sunday at the market, she had poured herself into dough and sugar to fill a void that no one else seemed to notice. Every pie, every cake, every sweet creation was a lifeline. It was how she survived the cruel absence of her family. And now, standing before her, they had come seeking something. She led them to the cream-colored leather sofa, the kind that cost more than they would see in a year, and sat herself down across from them. The waves crashed faintly below, echoing against the cliffs like a living heartbeat. She said, "Tell me," letting each word sink like a stone into water. "Why have you chosen to reappear in my life now?" Gregory shifted uncomfortably, Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. The room was thick with the weight of all the years they had stolen from her. It wasn't intentional," Eleanor said, finally, her voice soft, uncertain, fragile. "Things got complicated. Life, the children." Margaret laughed. Not cruelly, not bitterly, but with the sharp edge of truth. "Complicated?" she echoed. "You erased me from your lives. 12 years, 12 Christmases, 12 birthdays, 12 years where I baked cakes for no one, spoke to empty walls, and wondered if you had forgotten my face, my voice, my existence. You call that complicated?" Her lips quivered. Gregory opened his mouth, closed it again. Margaret took a slow breath, letting the ocean's rhythm fill her lungs. Her life had been measured in pies and patience, in flour and perseverance. Her hands had grown rough, her back stooped from carrying baskets of dough, but her pride had never broken completely. She had learned to survive, and now survival had a different flavor. Quiet, unyielding, and complete. "You are here now, not because you missed me, not because you loved me, not because you wanted to know your grandchildren. You are here because you smelled the scent of money, the fruit of a life I built without you. And yet you call it a mistake. But there are no mistakes here. Only choices. Choices you made consciously, cruelly, to erase me." They didn't answer. They couldn't. Margaret had stripped away every excuse, every polite lie they had prepared. The ocean pressed against the cliffs below, and in its voice she heard confirmation. The water remembers. The waves remember. And now so did she. She closed her eyes for a moment, and the smell of baked apples, cinnamon, vanilla, and caramel filled her mind. Memories of her daughter as a little girl, calling her the best cook in the world, of Sunday mornings spent laughing at small disasters in the kitchen. Those moments belonged to another life, another woman, who had believed love could conquer absence, who had hoped family meant something unconditional. But that woman was gone. Margaret Hale had returned from the ashes of loneliness, stronger, colder, and far less forgiving. "Do you have anything more to say?" she asked. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but Margaret was no longer the mother who could be swayed by manufactured sorrow. Gregory's calculating gaze met hers, but she saw through the mask. The ocean had shown her the truth. The past never leaves. It waits, it watches, and eventually it returns. And so had they. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the air. The sky was a pale gray, and the ocean below churned gently as though it had exhaled after some long, violent dream. Margaret sat in her leather chair, Duke at her feet, Clover curled beside him, and watched Eleanor and Gregory fidget nervously on the cream-colored sofa. The waves whispered against the cliffs, and Margaret could almost hear them repeating the questions she had longed to ask for 12 years. 12 years. Every one of those years had been a lesson in patience and pain. Every Sunday at the market, she had smiled at strangers who valued her more than her own family. Every pie baked, every tart glazed, every chocolate cake layered had been her defiance against absence, a proof of survival. She had not only survived the years they abandoned her, she had thrived. And now they were sitting before her, fragile and desperate. "Mom," Eleanor's voice cracked. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to undo 12 years of hurt with a few words. But Margaret had learned to hear the lies before they were spoken. She let her daughter flounder, watching every subtle gesture, the trembling of her hands, the avoidance of eye contact, the way Gregory's eyes roamed over the room like a predator calculating his gain. "You call this a visit?" Margaret asked softly, but her tone carried the weight of a decade of solitude. 12 years, 12 years of birthdays, of Christmases, of milestones I never shared with my own grandchildren. 12 years where my voice, my love, my presence was considered inconvenient, and you call this a visit? Gregory opened his mouth. Margaret's eyes locked onto his, and the faint color drained from his face. He wanted to charm, to manipulate, to redirect blame, but the years had sculpted Margaret into someone impervious to such games. She could see the calculations in his mind, the rehearsed excuses, the silent pleas for forgiveness without accountability. "It wasn't our intention," Eleanor murmured, her voice small, almost childlike. "We didn't mean to hurt you." Margaret laughed softly, the sound carrying across the marble floors, blending with the distant ocean. But it wasn't a kind laugh. It was sharp and cold, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has survived betrayal and learned the weight of truth. "You did intend it," she said. "Every missed call, every lost message, every canceled visit, every time you told yourself it was for the best, that was intention. You chose to remove me from your lives. And for what? Comfort? Convenience? Some illusion of a perfect family without the inconvenient presence of a mother?" The air between them thickened. Margaret could feel the waves outside pressing against the cliffs, like they were part of her argument, like the ocean itself agreed with every word. "I begged for strangers who valued me more than my own family. I spoke to empty walls and celebrated milestones in silence. I watched families pass by at the park and wondered if my grandchildren even knew I existed. And through it all, I survived," she continued, her voice rising slightly, but controlled, steady. "Do you know what that is? That is strength. That is life. That is the sound of someone refusing to be erased." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with tears. She wanted to tell Margaret everything, to explain why she had stopped calling, why she had let distance grow like a cancer. But the truth was complicated, tangled with fear, with control, with choices Eleanor had made under Gregory's influence. Margaret saw it all. She saw the subtle domination in his posture, the way he subtly undermined her daughter's words, the way he had restructured their lives to exclude her. And Margaret understood finally why the distance had existed, why it had lasted so long. It had not been because Eleanor had ceased to love her mother. It had been because she had been taught to forget her. "You are not sorry," Margaret said quietly, letting the words sink. "You are here because you finally realize that I exist, and maybe that my life is richer, fuller, better without your interference. But do not confuse this with forgiveness, because forgiveness, that is not mine to give." The ocean surged beneath them, as if punctuating her statement, and Margaret could feel the rhythm of the waves matching the rhythm of her heart. For 12 years, she had been building a life on her own terms. Every pie, every tart, every painstakingly crafted dessert had been her declaration, "I am not invisible, I exist." Eleanor's lips trembled, and Gregory finally spoke, his voice low, controlled. "Margaret, we thought you would understand. We thought—" "Understand what?" Margaret interrupted, her voice firm, unwavering. "That it is acceptable to erase your mother for 12 years? That you can build your life and deny me mine? That you can hide your children from me, the very children I carried in my womb, because it suited you?" Her hands clenched in her lap. She remembered every birthday missed, every Christmas without family, every solitary meal eaten in a quiet apartment while the world celebrated togetherness. She remembered the letters she never received, the phone calls that went unanswered, the invitations that never came. And yet here they were, expecting words, expecting mercy, expecting her to collapse at the sight of their faces. But Margaret Hale no longer belonged to that woman. The woman who had cried herself to sleep over a lost family had been replaced by someone else, someone tempered in solitude, strengthened in survival, unyielding in the face of past pain. "I don't need your apologies," she said. "I need the truth. And maybe, after 12 years, it is too late for the truth to fix what has been broken. But I deserve it nonetheless." The room fell silent again, except for the faint, persistent sound of the ocean below. It was the sound of time itself, patient, inexorable, remorseless. And Margaret listened to it, drawing strength from its eternal memory. "You will tell me everything," she said, her voice softening slightly, not from pity, but from the calm certainty of her own power. "I want to hear every detail, every choice, every lie, every reason you left me behind, because I deserve it. The ocean never forgets, neither do I." Eleanor swallowed hard, and Gregory's eyes lowered. Finally they began to speak. Slowly at first, haltingly, their carefully constructed excuses beginning to unravel under the weight of her gaze. The words tumbled out in fragments. The stress of Gregory's career, the fear of confrontation, the desire to protect their children. But Margaret heard the lies and the truths intertwined, the fabric of years stretched thin. And as they spoke, the waves outside whispered a quiet warning, a reminder of what waits beneath the surface. The past does not die. It waits, it watches, and it always returns. Margaret Hale leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the ocean fill her mind. 12 years of absence had brought them here. 12 years of silence had given her the power to see everything clearly. And the ocean, eternal and unforgiving, was witness to it all. She knew now that the reckoning had begun. The sun had long vanished behind the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. The house on the cliffs was silent now, save for the faint creak of boards and the distant pulse of the ocean against the rocks below. Margaret Hale sat in her leather chair, Duke and Clover at her feet, their steady breathing a small comfort in the immense quiet. 12 years of absence had taught her patience, had taught her to watch and to wait. And tonight, the waiting was over. Eleanor and Gregory had begun to speak, their carefully constructed defenses cracking under the weight of her presence. But Margaret knew there were truths they still guarded fiercely, secrets buried deeper than any apology could reach. She looked at her daughter, noticing the subtle tremble of her lips, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her hands clasped and unclasped, as though she could undo time itself by force of will. And then she looked at Gregory, whose confidence seemed threadbare, whose sharp gaze had dulled with worry. The years of calculated manipulation were unraveling in front of her eyes. You've told me about complications, about careers, about the children, Margaret said softly, yet every word carried the weight of a decade of hurt. But what you haven't told me, what you've buried beneath your excuses, that is what I need to hear. Because the ocean remembers, and so do I. Eleanor swallowed. Her voice was barely audible at first. Mom, there were things I didn't understand, things I thought I could manage on my own. I didn't want to hurt you, but I also didn't know how to stop it. Gregory, Margaret held up her hand, halting the confession. She didn't need the excuses yet. She needed the story, the truth behind the words stripped of rationalization. Start from the beginning. Every choice, every moment, every lie. I will listen. I will hear you. But do not waste my time with excuses. Gregory exhaled, a sharp, almost mechanical sound. He knew Margaret was no longer the woman who could be manipulated with charm. He began then, recounting years of hidden pressures, failures, and decisions made in fear. Margaret listened quietly, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, the rhythm almost mimicking the waves beyond. And then Eleanor spoke, haltingly, with a fragility that cut deeper than anger ever could. She spoke of fear, fear of losing her husband, fear of disappointing him, fear of the life they had promised their children. She spoke of the small moments when she longed to call, to visit, to write, but hesitated because Gregory was always there, always reminding her that Margaret's involvement would ruin everything. And slowly, as words poured out, Margaret realized the depths of the manipulation, the subtle poisoning of love that had kept her away from her own daughter. She realized how carefully the absence had been planned, disguised as concern, wrapped in a veneer of practicality. The ocean outside seemed to hush, listening intently as the years of silence and secrecy spilled into her ears. The waves moved as though carrying away the lies, revealing the raw truth beneath. Margaret's heart ached, not for herself, but for Eleanor, the daughter she had raised, now grown and trapped in a web she could not escape without breaking someone's heart. She let the story settle in the room like the scent of salt and rain. Her mind replayed the countless moments she had spent alone, the Christmases she decorated a tree for one, the birthdays celebrated with a single candle, the photos she had never taken, the calls that never came. And yet she did not feel anger, not yet. There was something deeper, a realization that had been growing steadily within her since she opened the door earlier that evening. I understand now, Margaret said quietly. Her voice carried the calm finality of the ocean itself. You were trapped by fear, by loyalty, by the choices you thought you had to make. But understand this, I am not here to punish you. I am here to reclaim my life, and reclaim it I will, with or without you. Eleanor's tears fell freely now, her hands covering her face as if trying to shield herself from the storm of truth. Gregory shifted uncomfortably, but even he understood. Margaret Hale was no longer a woman who could be intimidated or cajoled. She was a force forged by 12 years of solitude, by the patient work of rebuilding her life from the ground up. And the children? Margaret asked, her voice softening slightly. Do they know who I am? Have they grown up believing their grandmother was a stranger? Eleanor choked on the words, unable to answer immediately. The weight of what had been lost hung in the room like a dense fog. Margaret leaned back, letting the silence stretch, allowing the ocean's whisper to fill the spaces between them. You cannot undo the past, But you can be honest now. That is all I ask. Honesty. And in that moment, Eleanor and Gregory began to speak again. This time there were no excuses, no justifications, only the truth, laid bare and trembling. They spoke of choices made out of fear, of small manipulations that grew over time into distance, of love twisted into control. They spoke of moments when Eleanor wanted to reach out, to call, but could not, trapped by a marriage that demanded her loyalty above her family. And Margaret listened, letting the words wash over her, like the tide sweeping across the sand, carrying with it the detritus of the past. She realized then that her life, though marked by absence, was still hers. She had survived, she had thrived, and the ocean had been her witness, her companion, her constant. She rose from her chair, her old joints protesting slightly, and walked to the terrace. The wind whipped her hair, the salt air stung her skin, and the waves below roared with a quiet power. She turned back to the room, to Eleanor and Gregory, their faces pale and anxious. "Leave now," she said, her voice steady, calm but unyielding. "Go home. Think on what you've said. The ocean remembers everything, and so do I. But my life is mine again, and you have a choice. Either reclaim honesty and respect, or leave. Your children need both, but you cannot expect me to forgive without truth." And with that, Margaret Hale turned back to the ocean, letting the waves speak to her, filling her lungs with salt and wind, feeling the weight of 12 years lift, bit by bit. The past was still there, beneath the surface, but she was no longer drowning in it. She was standing on the cliffs, strong, and the ocean, patient, eternal, would always be her witness. Outside, the night deepened, the waves continued their endless rhythm, and Margaret Hale, old but unbroken, felt the first flicker of peace she had known in over a decade. The reckoning had begun, and though the journey ahead would be long, she knew one truth with certainty. The ocean does not forget, and neither does she.
The next morning, the sky was a pale silvery blue, and the ocean sparkled beneath the early sun like scattered diamonds. Margaret Hale stood on her terrace, wrapped in a heavy shawl, feeling the wind tug at her shawl and her hair. The waves below whispered secrets, and she listened as if the ocean could speak the words she had not yet said. 12 years of absence had left scars deeper than she had realized. But the ocean, eternal and patient, reminded her that time does not only take, it also gives. It had given her strength, resilience, and clarity. Eleanor and Gregory had left after the long night of confessions. They had spoken the truth, reluctantly, painfully, and Margaret had listened. She had heard every lie they had told themselves, every manipulation they had hidden behind concern, every excuse offered to cover their fear. And now the reckoning was over. Margaret did not feel triumph or revenge. She felt something far deeper, understanding. She understood that Eleanor had been trapped, not by malice, but by fear, by the manipulation of a life built around someone else's ego. She understood that Gregory had acted in ignorance and pride, believing that his control could create harmony where there was only separation. The ocean, calm now, mirrored her internal state. It roared at night, it crashed in anger, but it always returned to quiet understanding, a reminder of the balance of life. She turned back into the house. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and caramel, a reminder of mornings spent perfecting apple pies and chocolate tarts. She walked past the photos on the wall, pictures of Eleanor as a child, of a husband long gone, of moments she had saved in her memory because no one else had. Margaret touched one frame lightly, remembering. And then she thought of her grandchildren. 3 children she had never held, never guided, never kissed goodnight. Social media had provided glimpses, a blurry photo here, a school picture there. She had watched them grow at a distance, her heart both breaking and swelling at their lives. She knew she could not reclaim the lost years, but she could reclaim her presence in their lives now. Slowly, gently, she would reach out, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with patience, understanding, and love tempered by the wisdom of survival. Margaret began to write letters, handwritten, carefully considered, to Eleanor, to Gregory, to the children she had missed. Each word was deliberate, honest, and full of grace. She invited them into her life once more, not as a demand, but as an offering. She understood that reconciliation could not be forced. It would take time, like the tides shaping the shore, smoothing rough edges, creating beauty from persistence. Days turned into weeks. The ocean remained constant, its waves washing against the cliffs, its rhythm a constant reminder of endurance and memory. Margaret continued her routines, baking at dawn, walking along the beach at sunset, tending her small garden, selling pies at the farmer's market. Each activity, each small act was a declaration that life could continue, that joy could exist alongside pain, that the past could be honored without being allowed to define the future. And slowly, the world responded. Eleanor returned, hesitantly at first, with her children in tow. The grandchildren, wide-eyed and shy, explored the house, laughing at the pastries and the ocean view. She watched, her heart full but measured, her love unconditional but patient. She did not rush them, did not demand their devotion. She simply allowed them to see the woman she had become, the woman who had survived, thrived, and learnt the ultimate lesson, that absence cannot erase love, that truth cannot be hidden forever, and that the ocean, like memory, always remembers. Margaret spoke little at first, letting gestures, small smiles, and shared meals bridge the gaps of 12 years. The children learnt her voice, the warmth in her eyes, the careful hands that had once baked pies with endless patience. They laughed, stumbled, and learned to call her grandma with a reverence and joy that melted the coldest months of solitude. And at night, when the house was quiet and the children asleep, Margaret would step onto the terrace. The ocean stretched endlessly, reflecting moonlight like liquid silver. She breathed deeply, letting the salt air fill her lungs, and whispered a silent vow. She would never forget, and neither would the ocean. For the ocean holds everything: the past, the present, the sorrow, and the triumph. It does not judge, it does not forgive or condemn. It simply remembers, endlessly and patiently, just as Margaret Hale now did. She had been abandoned, forgotten, and erased. She had suffered the cruel absence of the ones she loved most. And yet, she had survived, and in surviving, she had become whole. The tides continued their eternal rhythm. The waves rolled in, kissed the cliffs, and whispered their secrets. Margaret smiled faintly, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the moonlight on the endless water. The ocean doesn't forget, and neither does she.